Secretary Kerry, I want first to thank you for appearing at the Haaretz Climate Conference, the first of its kind. And I would like to start on a personal perspective. Which is more difficult, to negotiate global climate accords or Israeli-Palestinian peace?
Everything is difficult these days. We're living in a very different time, but we're making some progress on the climate front. We have to make a lot more, and I'm happy to be here with you. I want to thank Haaretz and Hebrew University and EcoPeace and other partners for focusing our attention on the climate, and I'm really happy to be with you today.
Thank you. Let's look at the world, and I'd like to borrow from strategy from the doomsday clock. Are we 5 minutes to midnight on climate? 2 minutes, 10 minutes? Where are we? How urgent is this?
Well, one of the difficulties in persuading people to act with urgency is that the climate crisis is not like an asteroid hitting Earth, as we've seen in Adam McKay's movie, Don't Look Up. It's not a one-moment definition in 6 months. It's a process that will continue for the century and beyond, depending on what we do. But it clearly is reaching crisis stage. There's no question about that. We are seeing reports from the best scientists in the world warning us of tipping points beyond which you cannot return. The Arctic is potentially one. The Antarctic is another. Coral reefs, the ocean. The ocean is warming faster than any time in human history. And the chemistry of the ocean is changing more than it has changed in millions of years. So this crisis is on us. The hot days in the Middle East have grown. The drought has grown. Water challenges are real. So no one should say, this is off in the future. It's now, but we have a space. We have a gap here that the scientists have defined. The next 10 years, if we reduce our emissions globally by 45% over the next 10 years, we have a fighting chance of keeping the Earth's temperature increase to 1.5 degrees. And that matters. That is existential to the vulnerable countries like Bangladesh, to the island states and others.
So we're 10 years to midnight, but what is the most urgent?
10 years to avoid the worst consequences. That they can predict.
What is the most urgent step that needs to be taken now? The most important and urgent.
Well, the thing about the climate crisis that ought to encourage people is it's human created, so it's human solvable. We are the ones making choices that are bringing this crisis on ourselves. And it is coming about because we are pouring fossil fuel emissions unabated, and that's the key word, unabated, up into the atmosphere. And that is creating a blanket that contains the heat on the planet. It doesn't escape as it used to. And the more that the ice melts in the Arctic and the Antarctic, the more ocean that is visible. That is a dark body. And that dark body consumes heat. And then it accelerates the process of more melting, more dark. So the answer is that we have 10 years within which to make the choices that we can make to reduce emissions, cut back on the current use of fossil fuel, and accelerate the deployment of renewable energy, including the potential of some gas in the transition, and of course of nuclear, geothermal, wind, solar, and hydro. Those are the means we have to power our countries, power our economies, and we need to do a lot more of it a lot faster.
But this is very reasonable and convincing, and still, what is the main obstacle? Why can't we get there?
Human nature. Status quo.
Human nature exists for millions of years, existed without fossil fuels.
That is correct. And human nature has an ability to be very stubborn, It has an ability to hunker down and avoid reality. It has an ability to not allow facts to govern decision making. And so the climate has really been the victim of the status quo. Very powerful interests, which make a lot of money off of oil and gas and coal, don't want to give up that revenue stream, and certainly not quickly and easily. And so they resist. And there have been years and years, Aluf, this is something Haaretz should really trace, the years of denial. I mean, you can go back to 1960s and 50s. Rachel Carson was one of the first people to stand up and to take on an industry, the chemical industry, to say that you are poisoning people. You're killing them with DDT. Ultimately, she won an incredible victory. And that was really the birth of the modern environmental movement. And we've had incredible distortion, even lies regarding the impact of smoking and cigarettes, lies about the ozone, lies about climate itself. And certain players who have very big vested stakes in the status quo have avoided allowing people to have a uniform view of the truth here. The truth is, this is not about ideology. It's not about politics. This is about mathematics and physics. And the physics and the mathematics tell us exactly what is happening and exactly what we have to do to avoid it. The problem is politics.
As you say, that includes the mathematics of balance sheets and P&L.
Sure. Well, also, but the truth is the balance sheets work out because we will need energy. We will need to power our economies. We obviously aren't talking about shutting down a modern economy. We're simply talking about fueling it differently. And in many countries today, you're seeing nations move to 80, 90% renewable. And they're balancing their energy. For the times when the sun doesn't shine or the wind doesn't blow, you can have battery storage, you can have alternative, you could use gas as an intermediary. You could even use, there are a lot of grids now being built that are smart grids, where artificial intelligence can work decision-making for where to send the energy when, so that you have continuity in your provision of energy. We're just not buying into this possibility as rapidly as we should be, Aluf. And frankly, we're spending far more money cleaning up after storms, after fires, after mudslides, after tsunami. I mean, you look at what's happening, the tundra in the north of Siberia and in Russia has been burning at an extraordinary, unprecedented rate. The permafrost is thawing. So you have methane being released because of that, which has been contained for tens of thousands of years. And that methane is 20 to 80 times more damaging than CO2. So we have some big challenges, but they are, we can meet these challenges, and we can actually have a cleaner, safer, healthier world if we do.
But Secretary Kerry, aren't you afraid that the current tensions among global powers might put more obstacles on the need for global cooperation on this because of other interests that has nothing directly to do with it, but these power plays that are escalating, undermining what you're trying to achieve in multilateral cooperation?
That's a very astute question. You're right on target. And yes, there have been moments. I'll be very direct about it. China and the United States obviously are having differences of opinion on a number of different issues. But President Xi and President Biden have both agreed the one thing we cannot afford to be struggling over is climate. We have to cooperate. We have to work together. There is no way that one nation solves the climate crisis. We all have to be part of this solution.
Because every big ones, especially the major powers.
But yes, you're right. There are 20 countries that produce 80% of all the emissions. China and the United States are number one and number two. China produces 30% of all emissions. We are now at about 10%. And following us, you have India and Russia, Indonesia, a group of countries. And every country, though, has to step up here, because if you take the conglomerate, the aggregated amount of emissions coming from all the developing world, the less developed world, all put together, it's a very significant amount of emissions.
I agree, but can you reach a situation in which you're fighting on other fronts as if there's no climate, and you're cooperating on climate as if there are no other fronts?
Well, it requires strong leadership, and obviously it requires an element of compartmentalization. But we have done that historically. Aluf, you know that. Yeah. Countries, I mean, look at Israel and some of the neighborhood. Israel, despite the fact that it's not recognized by a number of countries, and there are tensions, obviously, has still been able to work security arrangements. It has still been able to find cooperation. And of course, recently, with the Abraham Accords, it was able to move forward to a sort of, new emerging relationship. When Ronald Reagan was president, every, month, you'd hear him several times talking about the evil empire, which was the Soviet Union. And yet he and Gorbachev sat down in Reykjavik, and they managed to turn around the fact of 50,000 warheads directed at each other. And we had the START agreement, where we now have reduced 50,000 warheads to about 1,500 or so warheads, which is still too many, but enough to feel that there is deterrence and security. So the answer is yes, we can do this. And we reached an agreement with China in Glasgow, where China has agreed to work with us in cooperation on reducing methane and on reducing CO2, on dealing with deforestation, and on creating a joint working group. And we will work together to try to make progress.
One last question, Secretary Kerry, and that's about Israel. Israel is small, but it's highly developed in science and technology. Where should Israel fit in this global effort? Did you raise any issues like that with Prime Minister Bennett or with other senior Israeli officials in
Absolutely.
this?
No, very much so. I mean, look, we all know, Israel is an extraordinary country, a tiny country. Land space has always been the great challenge for Israel, but nothing else. Israel has this remarkable capacity for innovation, research, development, education. And Israel, I know, is prepared to be helpful in the region and could be extraordinarily helpful, assisting other countries in the region with problems of agriculture. How do you turn a desert into fertile ground that you can begin to grow things on? How do you have, take Egypt, for instance. Egypt has a deficit in energy production, and also in agriculture. So we created an entity called AIM4C, which is Agricultural Innovation Mission for Climate. And we announced it in Glasgow. We're working with the UAE, among other countries on that. UAE is a major sponsor of it. Bill Gates is working with us on it. And Israel can be a key in helping other countries to learn more modern and environmentally sustainable agriculture practices. We all could work together on certain technologies that we need. Israel's a technology powerhouse. So I think Israel can play a key role here. And what we need to do is raise the ambition of every country in the region to reduce their emissions. And we're starting to do that now. We're seeing a number of countries, Tunisia, Saudi Arabia, Morocco, Israel, the United Arab Emirates have all raised their targets in order to try to do more to reduce emissions. We have Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, the UAE, Iraq, Tunisia, and Israel, who have joined the Global Methane Pledge. If we can reduce methane emissions globally by 30% the next 10 years, that's the equivalent of taking every automobile in the world, every ship in the world, every airplane in the world, every truck in the world, all of them to zero emissions in 10 years. That's the impact of achieving a 30% reduction globally in methane. It's doable. And 110 countries have now signed up to do this. So I'm very excited about the potential that we can move forward. And I have no doubt that Israel is setting another example with the Project Prosperity, which is an agreement with Jordan and with UAE in order to help Jordan in dealing with desalinization. But on the other hand, Jordan producing solar power, which can come to Israel. And it's a terrific example of the kind of thing we really ought to be building more, not just in that region, but around the world.
Thank you, Secretary Kerry, and your success will be the success of all of us. Thank you for appearing in our conference.
Thank you for doing the conference. And I want to thank President Herzog, an old friend, for his leadership and for what Israel is doing. Thank you.